Welcome to game number 2 of the World Chess Championship match 2024. Dean, coming off of the win from yesterday, has the white pieces and starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, the Italian, and bishop c5. Pawn to d3. There's lots of lines here for white besides something very solid with the move d3, and one line that I really like as white is this move pawn b4, very aggressive Evans gambit, and after bishop takes pawn c3 and pawn d4. Ding playing d3, knight f6, knight c3. Knight c3, not the most common move in this position, and not kind of sticking to the typical plans here for white in the structure. So something I want you to pay attention to throughout the game and in general with these structures is the pawn breaks for white on the dark squares and the pawn breaks for black on the light squares. These are the critical pawn breaks for both sides to be able to activate the pieces based on this pawn structure. In the game, we have knight c3. Gukesh takes about a minute here and plays the move pawn to a6, which is with the intention of bringing the bishop back to a7 and avoiding any loss of tempi with the moves a3, b4. It also potentially prepares the move pawn b5, grabbing space on the queen side. It's a very flexible move and asking white what approach they're going to take in the opening. Is white going to castle? And then black could decide if they're going to castle or continue their development with d6 activating their light squared bishop. Okay, we have pawn to a4, stopping b5 and grabbing space on the queen side, also giving the bishop some breathing room on a2. Gukesh plays pawn d6, and we have castles. Pawn to h6. All right, some of you might be thinking, why not bring the bishop out to g4? And this is what I was thinking during the game. And after bishop to g4, we can play the move pawn to h3. The bishop doesn't want to take the knight, otherwise white will get the bishop pair, and after takes, knight d4, we can bring the queen back to d1, and with the two bishops, the king can sidestep out of the line of this bishop and play the move pawn to f4, and white would stand quite well. And if you bring the bishop back for, let's say, intermediate players, we have a big question as to whether or not we should play the move g4. So a problem in this position is black is going to play the move knight to d4 and add pressure to the pinned piece. With inserting this move h3, white is able to prevent knight d4 and pressure on f3 with the following line. So let's say white plays the move, just for example, king to h1, which is not necessarily a good move, but okay, let's say bishop g5 instead. And if knight d4 happens now, we're going to play the move g4, removing the pressure along the f3 knight. Otherwise, white would be in some serious danger. In addition to that, if white were to play the move g4 right now, black has the option of sacrificing. Knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes. The knight is coming to d4 and the queen is coming to f6, and although black is a piece down, this is a very difficult position to defend and not a very comfortable position to be in. So firstly, knight d4 is a huge threat, so bishop e3 should be played, and after queen to f6, we can play king to g2. Maybe we can play knight d5 here, but actually I don't think it works. We can play king g2, and there's still a tremendous amount of pressure along this diagonal. So white can solve this problem by asking a question to the bishop first immediately with h3, and then not going for g4, but waiting for the move knight d4 and then playing the move g4. There's a big difference, and the point is, like, if I go king h1 as an example and knight d4 happens, then after g4 and knight takes, we're not obliged to take back and allow the bishop to have this pressure. We can take on d4 first, and it's actually white who is the one pinning black's knight to the bishop on h5. The knight could come back here in this case, and the bishop renews the threat against the queen, but white just picked up the knight on d4 and can come back to f3. Okay, back to the game. After pawn to h6, Ding played bishop to e3, contesting the bishop on c5 and putting some control over the d4 square. And Gukesh played bishop to e6. This game had been played 2 times before on this Lead Chess database. Pragananda played in both of these games with the one game against Giri as the white pieces and one game with the black pieces against Elyanov. We have some tension between these bishops, and we always have a question as to how to play with these bishops. Should white initiate the trades? Should white allow black to initiate the trades? It's not so clear always which side is going to favor the trades. From my perspective, when I see these bishop trades, what I look for is who's the person who can initiate the pawn breaks and who does it favor to trade in terms of who has more control over the position. So if black, if white were to trade on c5, white doesn't have this pawn break on d4, and black would be able to dominate the d4 square as well. So from my perspective, taking on c5 would not be an ideal way for white to continue unless I had some concrete manner. Now you might ask, what about the doubled pawns? Yes, black has some issues with the doubled pawns, but the central control that black has fully compensates for the doubled pawns in this position. In addition to that, although white has the d5 square, black can one day play this move pawn c6, permanently controlling d5. So this is not an ideal capture for white in this position. Okay, what about the capture on e6? So just to share with you what Ding played, which was an amazing move. He played the move pawn to a5, grabbing space on the queen side. What if you take on e6? Well, if we take on e6, the problem is you have this open f-file. So if black castles and gets the rook along the f-file, then black can put up a lot of pressure on the f-file long term. This isn't to say that black is better in this position, but black is the one playing for something in the position, and if white cannot take advantage of this weak pawn on e6, generally with the move c3, queen b3 already being played, then black is fine in the position, and black is the one with some play. Black controls the dark squares, f4 and d4 in this position, so I see this idea of bringing the knight to e7, then g6, and clamping down on the dark squares, and I wouldn't be surprised if g5 later on is an important move to get a grip on the f4 square. Okay, in the game, Ding plays the move pawn to a5. And this is a pawn sacrifice. Gukesh first captures on c4. You can take on c5 or you can take back. Ding takes back, and now Gukesh played castles. The big question of this game is whether or not Gukesh should go for this move bishop to b4 and go after the pawn. So you're going after the pawn on a5. In addition to that, you're putting pressure on the knight, which means you're going after the pawn on e4. So what do you think would be the best move for white in this position? For sure, this is prep by Ding. He's not going to allow the loss of the pawn so easily. The question is, what exactly is the big deal here? Why can't I just play bishop b4, pick up the pawn on a5, and be up material? Or even take the knight on c3. So what would you play here? As white, pause the video if you'd like and analyze. And the key idea here is white can sacrifice another pawn to move knight to d5. White is not allowing bishop takes on c3, which of course is a really big problem here. But black now has the option of taking on e4 or taking on a5. And I was digging a little bit to analyze with the use of the engine to try to understand better, and without the engine as well, what is the big deal? Why can't black pick up not only one pawn, but a second pawn as well? So black has two options here. They can take on a5 with the bishop, basically, or take on e4. Taking on e4 looks like a very safe and clean approach to the position, so I would analyze this first. And after knight takes e4, white has the move queen to d3. The knight is hit and you have two options. You can defend the knight with the move pawn f5, or you can bring the knight backwards, either to the f6 or c5 square. The game gets really wild after the move pawn to f5. This is a critically weakening move. The king is open on the light squares, and white has this move queen b3. Attacking the bishop and attacking the b7 pawn, so clearly white has some compensation for the loss of the pawn, and they're probably going to win the pawn on b7 right away, or create some deadly threats along this diagonal. So really not what black would want to see on the board. It'd be very uncomfortable. But the real question is knight f6 or knight c5. So knight f6 is a much safer approach. We're bringing the knight back to exactly where we were. We did our job. But here again, we have the move knight takes on b4, knight takes on b4, and queen to b3, trying to capture the b7 pawn as well as potentially play the move pawn c5 and undermine the pawn on e5. The knight has to move or be defended. If the knight is defended, we can kick away the knight and win the pawn on b7. White would get the material back plus have the initiative. So then the question is, what about knight c5? Knight c5 also wins a tempo against the queen, keeps the knight on a very solid square, and takes away the idea of queen to b3. So Ding had to have this prepared again, and the move that would have to follow is the move queen to f5. So white is down one pawn, and black has the opportunity to win another pawn. But if you take this other pawn, you're going to be in not a world of hurt, but you're going to be under some serious pressure. So for example, let's say bishop takes on a5. Now white, in order to justify this loss of two pawns, white has the move rook takes a5, which is an excellent move in this position. Knight takes on a5, and the move knight takes on e5. We're attacking f7, and if you take on e5, good luck castling for the black king. Plus, with the rook coming to the e file, the knight's on the side of the board. White is having a tremendous attack in this position. And if you don't take and you simply castle, this is the line that is just gets really wild. And kudos to Ding to be able to find these ideas to make the opponent go wrong. This is high level chess, and I think that until somebody reaches, let's say, a 2400 level, it's difficult to come up with ideas related to compensation. How do you know if your two pawns plus a rook sacrifice is going to lead anywhere? And I think this can only be done in this type of position with extreme amount of preparation and an understanding of how positions can go in the future. Playing this over the board and finding these moves is close to impossible. So being able to prep is the key to doing well in these positions. From Black's point of view, how do you avoid making the decision during your games to, let's say, go after the pawn? Well, I think you have to assess whether or not your opponent is higher rated than you. If they're setting a little trap, you should be quite cautious. And if they're lower rated than you, take a good look at what could potentially happen in terms of how much pressure is going to be on your position. So in this case, after black castles, white is down 3 points in the position, but after the move knight to g4, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces in the attack on the king side. This is not a kind of position that any player with a black pieces wants to defend. Let's say you bring your knight back in the game, avoiding the threat of pawn to b4, knight to c6. The game is over after the move knight to f6 check, takes, and after a knight to e5, stopping the checkmate on g4 to g7, we have the move f4, kicking away the knight, and after knight g6, the game is pretty much over. If you move the king, if you sack the queen, you're lost. If you move the king, then queen h5 wins the game. Okay, so this was the critical moment of the game, and Ding gave Gukesh the option of playing the move bishop to b4. Gukesh did not go for it. He recognized that there was an enormous amount of activity that white would generate, and Gukesh, having lost the previous game, wanted none of it. He took on c5, and after captures, played the move b3, and after queen takes, rook takes, played rook to d8. This endgame is not so clear, even though the position seems quite equal. We have two knights for both sides, two rooks for both sides. There are some small differences in the position, and I think it's very easy to go wrong in these positions more than it is to go right. The rook on a1 consistently has to defend this pawn on the a5 square. So from that perspective, it seems like black has a slight initiative. But it was actually Ding who decided to play the move rook c1, playing for something more in the position. You cannot take so easily, as black would get complete control over the d-file, and again, the rook on a1 is tied to the defense on the a5 pawn. But it's possible to play the move rook c1 with the intention of ceding or conceding the d-file only to later win it back. I was trying to analyze this position. Both sides, by the way, still have tons of time on the timer. Ding has 1 hour 46 minutes left, and Gukesh 1 hour 25 minutes left, and we have an endgame position. So both players should have no problem being able to pick out some key plans in order to make progress and avoid any tactical shots as well. And I was trying to think from this position, how exactly is black supposed to make progress? We have pressure on the a5 pawn, we have pressure on the e4 pawn, but we cannot activate the rook along the d-file. So the first thing that comes to mind is simply improving the rooks, bringing the rooks to the d-file and controlling the d-file as much as possible. Then the second thing I want to ask is how to improve my position to its maximum. And I'm going to do that by targeting some weaknesses. The c2 pawn is weak and the a5 pawn is weak. So let's see how Gukesh continued. He played knight d4, allowing the capture on e5. Interesting that both sides are giving the opponent the chance to go wrong, giving the opponent to make a decision which is going to allow activity. My question for you is, can white simply grab the pawn on e5, or is it a trap of some sorts? Okay, white can fully capture the pawn on e5, but the problem is black will have a better position. After the move rook to e8, attacking the knight and attacking the pawn, if you go back with the knight, we can simply win the pawn back on e4 with a better position for black. But if you try to defend the knight, key idea is the move knight takes e4. Once both knights are along the e-file, black will eventually have this move pawn to f6. So after knight takes on e4, we can first play the move knight to e2, forking the king and the rook, or we can play f6 right away. And after king to f1, we can take the rook, but even better is taking the knight, taking with the knight on f4 and winning back the material next move, and black would be better in this position. Okay, another option is if you take the rook on c1. The problem in this case is that the knight is not getting back into the game, and after the move knight to c3, white is going to be better because the knight is trapped. After rook to c1, knight to d4 was played, and knight goes back to e1, avoiding the doubled pawns on the f3 square and avoiding going into these complications with knight takes e5. Black played rook d6. We have king to f1, covering the e2 square for good. Now the knight can move without having to worry about black's fork on e2. And after pawn to g6, we have rook to d1, regaining control over the d-file now that the knight defends the c2 pawn. We have rook to d8 and pawn to f3, king to g7 and king to f2, and pawn to h5. I was wondering if white would be able to get some play, or if black would be able to get some play in this position, but it seemed that every line that I analyzed fizzled out to a draw. For example, after knight to a4, we can play the move knight to d7 at least, and after rook to b1, The problem in this case is that c3 loses the b3 pawn, so rook b1 first. Pawn b5 trying to kick away the knight so that the c5 pawn is no longer under attack. And after takes pawn c3, white would be winning material in this position. So black cannot try to be this aggressive with these moves pawn to b5. And if they can't play pawn to b5 and they are going to play, let's say, pawn to c3, which black can anticipate by dropping the knight back, having the rooks being able to be protected, then the problem I find is that um, white's going to have a difficult time to make progress in the position, but black as well, if they ever move the knight, the pawn on c5 falls. So something is going to have to give in this position for either side. They might have to take a little bit of a risk in order to try to make progress. In the game, after knight to e2, we have knight to c6, again putting pressure on the a5 pawn, now threatening the rook on d1, and we have the move knight to c3. And again knight to d4, and again knight to e2, and again knight to c6, and again knight to c3, and again knight d4, and the game ended in a draw. Okay, let's say we wanted to play for a win. Let's say black is in the driver's seat because of this weak pawn on a5. Let's say black was trying to win the position. Again, the problem is that somehow white is able to keep pressure on both the c5 and the e5 pawn. So I was playing around with some of the lines, and I tried the move knight to b4, right? Very logical. We're threatening the move rook to d2, and after the trade, the c2 pawn probably will fall. But white can simply play the move king to e2, covering the d2 square. After a move like knight to h7, it seems like all of black's pieces are really well placed except for the knight on f6. So what comes to mind is being able to improve the quality of our knight and playing a move like knight to h7, knight to g5, knight to e6, and either knight f4, knight d4 would be a great idea. However, after the move rook takes on d6, you're forced to capture with either the pawn or the rook. If you take with the rook, white cannot play the move rook to d1 because after this trade, the a5 pawn will fall. But after we can take with the rook, and white has the move a knight to a4, again attacking the c5 pawn, and the black knight is a little bit slow. If you play the move pawn b6, the problem is that the a file is now opened up, and white can get rid of this weakness on the a5 square. So this is not ideal for black, and if you take and the black pawn takes back, controlling the c5 square, the problem is the b6 square is now weak, and white can play the move either knight d5 or even knight a4 heading into the b6 square. The rook also doesn't control the d file anymore, which is one of black's key advantages. So with that in mind, both players recognized in this position that there wasn't a clear way to make progress without having some risk involved in the position. Gukesh as well, coming off of that loss yesterday, I'm sure is happy to be able to get this draw. And Ding as well is probably happy as well to keep the position level and also play from a position of strength. He wasn't afraid to go for these pawn sacrifices to get a tremendous amount of activity. And this is what I love to see from Ding. It's being able to transition the position. It's a nice way to say it. Transition the position in a favorable way if the opponent is going to take some risks. Let's stay tuned for game number 3, which is happening tomorrow. And I look forward to doing the recap. And see you guys tomorrow.